Madeline Avery hadn't been back to Clearwater, Oregon, in nearly a decade. She arrived on the early morning train, stepping onto the gravel platform with nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart full of quiet regret. The town looked the same, timeless and stubborn, like it refused to let go of the past. Maybe that's what hurt the most. She had left Clearwater after high school, chasing an ambitious career and a bigger life, and she'd never looked back. Until now. Until the letter from her mother arrived, not an email, not a text, but an actual letter, written in delicate cursive. "The bridge by the creek collapsed last week. I thought you should know." That was all it said. No pleasantries. No, "I miss you." But Madeline had known what it meant. The bridge. Their bridge. A narrow wooden footbridge that stretched across Clearwater Creek, at the edge of the Avery family property. It was the place where Madeline and her older brother, Luke, used to meet after school, where her father would whistle old folk songs while fishing, where she once carved her initials into the handrail like it was a promise to never forget. And now it was gone. Madeline dragged her suitcase down the familiar dirt path toward her childhood home, a pale green cottage with chipping paint and a porch swing that still creaked with the wind. The garden was overgrown. The mailbox leaned slightly. It was all still here, frozen in time, like it had been waiting for her. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes tired. "You came," she said. Madeline nodded. "I didn't think I would, but—" Her voice trailed off. The silence between them wasn't new. It had stretched for years, long before the bridge had fallen. Words had been lost after Luke died in that car accident 10 years ago. After Madeline left and never really called. After life got complicated and neither of them knew how to rebuild what was broken. "Come in," her mother said quietly. The house smelled like cinnamon tea and dust. A photo of Luke still hung above the fireplace. His smile was faded from sunlight, but his eyes still held that spark Madeline remembered. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where they used to eat spaghetti on Sundays. Her mother placed a steaming mug in front of her. They didn't speak for a while. Finally, her mother said, "The town's planning to replace the bridge. Metal this time. Nothing special." Madeline's hands tightened around the mug. "It was special to me. I know." Another silence. Then, a softer voice. "I thought maybe you'd want to be part of rebuilding it." Madeline looked up, her eyes stinging. "I think that's why I came." Later that afternoon, Madeline walked alone toward the edge of the property, where the tall grass grew wild and the trees stood like old sentinels. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, but she barely noticed. When she reached the creek, she stopped. The bridge was gone. All that remained were 2 moss-covered stumps on either bank, and a few broken boards tangled in the reeds below. The water still flowed, oblivious. The world had moved on. But Madeline stood there, unmoving, frozen between memory and now. She could still see them, Luke daring her to jump from the edge, Dad teaching her how to whistle through her fingers, Mom calling them in for dinner as the sun dipped behind the trees. It had all happened right here. And now it was all just echoes. A crunch of gravel behind her broke the spell. She turned to see an older man in work boots and a clipboard. "Didn't mean to sneak up," he said kindly. "You must be Avery's daughter." "I am," she replied. "Madeline. Name's Cliff. Town engineer. They called me about the rebuild." She nodded, unsure what else to say. He studied the remains. "Shame about this one. It had character." Madeline stepped closer. "It was more than a bridge. It was ours." Cliff gave her a thoughtful look. "You thinking about rebuilding it the same way?" "I don't know," she said truthfully. "But I think it deserves more than concrete and railings." He smiled. "Then come by town hall tomorrow. Let's talk ideas." That night she sat in her old room, which hadn't changed much except for the silence. She flipped through an old photo album. There was Luke in his baseball jersey, her dad with flour on his nose, her mother laughing, really laughing in a way she hadn't seen in years. A knock on the door. Her mom peeked in. "You okay?" Madeline hesitated, then nodded. "I think I want to stay for a bit. Help with the rebuild. Maybe help with more than that." Her mother stepped in fully. "I'd like that." They stood in the doorway a moment longer, and though neither said it, they both knew this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about rebuilding something between them too. The next morning, Madeline sat on a cold metal chair inside the Clearwater Town Hall, surrounded by old faces and newer wrinkles. The walls were lined with framed photos of mayors past, fishing tournaments, and centennial parades. Everything smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. Cliff was already there, a few papers in hand, nodding as she entered. "Glad you came." The meeting began casually, with talk of potholes, library funding, and a broken vending machine in the high school lobby. Then someone brought up the bridge. "Madeline Avery is here," Cliff said, standing. "She's volunteered to help with the restoration of the footbridge on Avery Creek." All heads turned. Some nodded politely, others whispered. One older woman with a braid of silver hair raised her hand. "I remember your father," she said. "Henry Avery built that bridge with his own hands, didn't he?" Madeline blinked. "He did?" "Back in '87, the woman continued. "Town wanted to tear down the old log crossing. Said it was dangerous. But your father said some things are worth preserving." Another voice chimed in. "He got the lumber donated, built it in 3 weekends, even carved names into the railing is Luke's and yours." Madeline's chest tightened. She had never known. After the meeting, Cliff handed her a folder. "Design options," he said. "But if you want to rebuild it the way your dad did, we'll need more than permits, we'll need people." Madeline looked around the town square as she stepped outside. The bakery was still there, the barber shop, the old bookstore with dusty windows. All the things she had once rushed to leave now called her quietly back. That night, at the dinner table, she shared what she'd learned with her mother. "I didn't know Dad built the bridge," she said softly. Her mother smiled into her tea. "He didn't talk about it much, but I remember the blisters, the way he came home covered in sawdust and pride." Madeline looked out the window toward the trees. "I want to rebuild it like he did. Same design, same wood, maybe even the same initials." Anne reached across the table and took her hand. That would mean everything. The following week, Madeline dove into action. Cliff connected her with a local lumber supplier willing to donate wood at cost. A retired shop teacher offered to help with planning. And, to her surprise, the high school's construction class volunteered to assist. Of their students had grandparents who lived near the creek and wanted to help restore the path they used every day. One afternoon, Madeline walked into Clearwater Hardware with a list of supplies and a tight knot in her stomach. She hadn't set foot in that store since she was 17. Behind the counter stood a man with thick gray hair and a knowing smile. "Well, if it isn't Maddie Avery." "Hi, Mr. Dobbs." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Heard you're trying to bring back the bridge. Good. That old thing deserved better than to rot away." She handed him her list. "I'm trying. Still learning." Dobbs scanned the paper. "This looks like a start. But bridges aren't just about nails and boards. They're about people willing to walk across them, especially when it's hard." Madeline didn't answer. She didn't need to. She spent most evenings sketching revised blueprints at the kitchen table while her mom cooked quietly in the background. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes they wouldn't, but the silence no longer felt sharp. It felt charred. One night, Anne brought out an old shoebox filled with photos and letters. There, Madeline found a picture she'd never seen her father, shirtless, laughing beside a pile of wooden beams, with young Luke on his shoulders and a tiny version of herself clinging to his arm. She traced the image with her fingertip. "I think he built that bridge because he needed something solid," Anne said. "He didn't have a perfect father growing up, but he wanted to leave something better." Madeline nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. The next morning she returned to the creek. The first beams had arrived, the stumps had been cleared, a new foundation would be poured by next week. She picked up a hammer and drove in the first nail. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but with purpose. And as the sound echoed through the trees, Madeline felt something shift inside. Not just the beginning of a bridge, the beginning of coming back to life. Madeline wasn't expecting to see Jesse Nolan at the site. He was leaning against a stack of lumber when she arrived one morning, arms crossed, wearing a tool belt and a slight smirk. Time had filled out his frame and softened his features, but those green eyes were unmistakable. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," he said. She tried to sound casual. "Didn't think I'd come back," he nodded. "I figured. You were always the one looking out the window, not the mirror." Madeline chuckled despite herself. "You still talk in riddles." "I teach English now," he said, grinning. "High school. Someone has to make metaphor relevant." Jesse had been Luke's best friend. They were inseparable growing up: baseball games, creek swims, sneaking out on summer nights. When Luke died, Jesse disappeared not long after the funeral. Madeline had always wondered if grief or guilt drove him away. Now he was here, offering to help rebuild a bridge. "Cliff said you might need extra hands," he said. "And I figured, maybe it's time." They worked in silence for a while, measuring, leveling, lifting. Jesse knew what he was doing, his movements, deliberate, confident. "You know," he said after a long pause, "Luke always talked about this bridge like it was magic. He said it was the one place everyone in the family could be together without pretending." Madeline smiled faintly. "He wasn't wrong." Jessie glanced at her. "He wanted to fix things between you and your mom. I don't think he knew how." Madeline looked down. "Neither did I." He set a beam aside and leaned against the frame they were building. "He left something for you? I didn't know if I should keep it, but now. Maybe it's time you saw it." She froze. "What do you mean?" "A letter. He wrote it before that night. Gave it to me the week before the crash. Told me to give it to you if he ever couldn't." Her breath caught. "You kept it all this time?" He nodded slowly. "It never felt like the right moment. Until now." That night, Jessie met her by the creek. He handed her a small, folded envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and her name, Maria, was written in Luke's handwriting, the loops familiar and soft, like he'd taken his time. "I never opened it," Jessie said. "Didn't feel like it belonged to anyone but you." Madeline's hands trembled. She sat on a log near the creek, the unfinished bridge casting long shadows over the water. The hum of crickets filled the silence between them as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet. Folded once. "Maddie, if you're reading this, something probably happened, and I never got the chance to say this in person. I hope it didn't. But if it did, well, here's everything I never had the guts to say out loud. You were always the brave one. You left. You chased things. You didn't let Clearwater shrink you the way I let it shrink me, but I stayed. Because part of me needed to. Because I was hiding. There's something you never knew. Jessie and I, we were more than friends. I didn't know how to tell you, or Mom, or Dad, and for a long time I hated myself for not being honest. But with Jessie, I felt like I could finally breathe. And then I panicked. I pushed him away. I pulled away from everyone. I guess I'm writing this because if I'm gone, you deserve the truth. All of it. Not because it changes how much I loved you, but because I don't want to be remembered for half of who I was. You once told me that bridges were built to hold weight. Well, I hope this one holds the weight of what I never got to say. Be kind to Jessie. He loved me when I didn't know how to love myself. Love always, Luke." When she finished reading, her hands were wet. She hadn't even realized she was crying. Jessie sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just being there. Madeline folded the letter carefully and looked out over the creek. The stars were reflected in the moving water, dancing like memories just out of reach. "Did anyone else know?" she asked softly. "No," Jessie replied. "He was afraid. Said he couldn't disappoint your parents. Or you. I wouldn't have been disappointed," she whispered. "I know that now," Jessie said. "But he didn't." Madeline looked down at her hands. "I wish I could have told him it was okay. That he didn't have to carry it alone." "You can still tell people," Jessie said. "You can help someone else who thinks they have to hide." The night stretched on, quiet and vast. And for the first time in years, Madeline didn't feel angry at the silence. She felt peace. Because Luke had finally spoken, the town's harvest festival came earlier than usual that year. The community center was strung with soft white lights, and tables overflowed with apple pies, chili pots, and donated quilts for auction. Children raced between hay bales while the older residents stood in tight circles, catching up on old gossip and new grandchildren. It was Clearwater at its warmest, but Madeline felt the cold tremble of nerves beneath her skin. She stood near the rebuilt frame of the bridge, still unfinished but already stretching halfway across the creek like a promise in motion. Jessie stood nearby, adjusting a loose beam. Her mother chatted with Mrs. Dobbs, her face softer than Madeline had seen in years. In her pocket, the letter crinkled with every move she made. Luke's letter. She had debated all week whether to share it. It wasn't just her story, it was his. And Jessie's. And in a way, the whole town's, because the weight of silence didn't belong to one person alone. As twilight descended, Cliff tapped the mic near the makeshift stage. "Thanks to everyone for coming," he began. "Before we light the lanterns tonight, Madeline Avery asked to say a few words." Madeline felt her breath catch. She climbed the steps slowly, heart pounding like thunder in a jar. "I wasn't sure I'd ever come back to Clearwater," she began. "But the day I did, I found out the bridge my dad built had collapsed." A murmur moved through the crowd. "And now, we're rebuilding it. Not just for the crossing, but for everything it stood for." She paused, glancing at Jessie, then her mom, then the trees swaying just behind them. "My brother Luke died 10 years ago, and before he did, he wrote me a letter." She unfolded it, fingers trembling. I'd like to read part of it now because sometimes the things we don't say become the heaviest burdens. And then, voice clear, eyes steady, Madeline read aloud the words her brother had never spoken out loud but had written with everything he had left. When she finished reading, the night air held its breath. For a moment no one moved. Then came the sound of someone gently setting down a cup. A chair scraped softly against the floor, and slowly, the crowd began to react not with shock, not with discomfort, but with something quieter. Something like recognition. Madeline folded the letter and tucked it back into her pocket. I read this because Luke never got the chance to be known for all of who he was, she said. And I think part of rebuilding this bridge means making space for truth even, if it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Jesse had stepped closer, his posture still but strong, like he was holding her up without touching her. And then, a voice came from the crowd. It was the older woman with the silver braid, Mrs. Hale, the retired librarian. My son came out after his father passed, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. I wish he'd had a Luke in his life. Another person, a man near the back, cleared his throat. My brother was like Luke. He hid so much. We lost him in more ways than one. The stories began spilling out not loudly, not dramatically, but as quiet offerings. Little bridges extended across invisible spaces. After the speeches, the lanterns were lit. Paper globes floated up into the navy sky, carrying wishes, grief, and all the things left unsaid. Madeline stood with her mother, watching hers drift higher. I'm proud of you, Anne whispered. Not just for rebuilding the bridge, but for giving Luke the voice he never used. Madeline nodded, tears in her eyes. I think I needed to hear it just as much. Later that night, after the lanterns had faded, she and Jesse walked back to the unfinished bridge. The planks were lit by the moon, silver and quiet. You didn't have to read it, Jesse said. But you did. I was terrified. I know. They stopped near the edge, where the final beams would soon connect both sides. Funny, she said. I thought building a bridge would mean fixing something outside me, but it's more like stitching something back together inside. Jesse smiled. That's what bridges do. They carry weight, but they also let you cross. Nails. Planks. Sweat. For the next few weeks, Madeline worked alongside Jesse, Cliff, and a rotating cast of volunteer students, retirees, parents every day inching closer to finishing the bridge. The final beams were laid, the handrails carved, just like her father had done. Jesse even replicated the initials Luke had once engraved in Lee this time. They added a new one at the end. M+L+J. The bridge wasn't just restored, it was reimagined, carrying new stories within its old bones. One morning, while tightening bolts on the final span, Cliff looked up from his clipboard and asked casually, So, you sticking around? Madeline hesitated. Honestly, I don't know. He gave a nonchalant shrug. Well, we've got a few benches to install if you're looking for a reason. That night, over dinner, Anne brought it up too. You're smiling more, she said, refilling Madeline's tea. You don't even flinch when I play my records anymore. Don't get too excited, Madeline teased. I still hate the polka ones. They both laughed an easy, rolling laugh that filled the kitchen the way it used to. But in the quiet afterward, Madeline looked out the window at the bridge, now nearly complete. I've got an apartment in Portland, she said. A job offer, too. Teaching writing. Anne nodded, but something in her eyes flickered. You think that's what you want? I don't know, Madeline admitted. For the first time, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to chase. Her mother smiled gently. Then maybe stop chasing. Maybe let something find you for once. Madeline didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on the backyard, where the outline of the bridge gleamed silver in the moonlight. She didn't know yet if Clearwater was her future, but it was definitely no longer just her past. The bridge opening wasn't grand, but it was full. Full of people, full of light, full of something unspoken that hung in the early morning air like dew on the leaves. A soft breeze moved through the trees as Madeline stood at one end of the newly finished bridge, her hand resting on the smooth wood rail. Jesse stood on the opposite side, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. Cliff handed her a pair of large silver scissors. Tradition, he said with a smile. A simple ribbon stretched across the middle of the bridge-white satin, tied loosely between two carved posts. The initials glinted beside it in the rising light. M+L+J. Madeline held her breath. She cut the ribbon. A quiet cheer went up. Nothing wild, but meaningful. The townspeople began to cross, in pairs, in families, a lonesome touching the wood like it carried memory, others pausing to read the carved names. Her mother was the last to cross. She paused beside Madeline and said, "He would have been proud." Madeline smiled. "I hope so." They crossed together. Later, after the crowd thinned and the sun climbed higher, Madeline and Jessie sat on the bench overlooking the water. It had been carved from the same wood as the bridge, etched with the word welcome in looping script. "You ever think about staying?" Jessie asked. "I think about it a lot." "And?" She looked down at her hands, then out across the creek. "I think I was waiting for permission to start over, to come home, to love again. But I realized, no one gives you that. You just decide." He turned to face her, eyes soft. "Then decide." She leaned back, a breeze catching her hair. "I'm not going back to Portland," she said finally. "Not now, maybe not ever." Jessie reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Then this is for you." She opened it. It was a job listing from Clearwater High School. Creative writing teacher, full-time. "They're desperate," Jessie said with a grin. "And I might have told them about you." Madeline laughed. A full, unguarded sound. "You're insufferable. You're hired." They sat there a moment longer, saying nothing, letting the quiet settle not as silence, but as something sacred. As the sun rose higher, the bridge stood strong beneath them, built of stories, sweat, sorrow, and love. Madeline had crossed it, and now, she was ready to stay. The bridge no longer creaked. It had taken weeks for Madeline to stop listening for the old groan of rotted wood beneath her feet, but now, crossing it felt like second nature. She crossed it every day now. To the bookstore. To the high school. To Jessie's porch on evenings when neither of them felt like saying much but didn't want to be alone. She even found herself crossing it for no reason at all, just to feel the breeze shift and to remind herself she could. Life in Clearwater didn't move fast. Some days were quiet enough to hear the wind through the trees. Other days she stayed late at the school, helping a student draft a story about grief wrapped in science fiction. One boy wrote about a father made of stardust. A girl wrote a poem about a bridge that connected the living and the dead. Madeline began collecting their words, keeping them in a folder titled, "What They Carry." At home, her mother cooked more. She hummed. They had good days, awkward days, silent days but never cold ones. One morning, Madeline found a stack of old journals in the attic her father's. She hadn't known he wrote. Some entries were mundane, fishing notes, weather patterns. Others were something more. "Luke spent an hour under the bridge today, just listening to the creek. I think he needed stillness. I forget sometimes that we all do." Madeline ran her fingers over the ink, as though it could bring back time. She didn't cry. She simply closed the journal and held it to her chest, then placed it on the shelf above her desk. Later that evening, as Jessie walked her home beneath a sky flushed with orange and gold, he asked, "You still writing your own stuff?" She shrugged. "I write lesson plans." He stopped walking. "That's not what I meant." Madeline looked at the path ahead, her house aglow, the bridge behind, and in between them, space. "I don't know what I'd write about." He smiled. "Start with what you couldn't say, then move toward what you need to hear." A week after Jessie's question, Madeline sat at her desk and opened a new notebook. The pages were crisp and clean, almost too clean, like untouched snow. She stared at them for a long time, chewing the end of her pen. Then she wrote the first line. "This story begins with a bridge that broke, and the people it tried to hold together." The words flowed slowly at first. Her handwriting was uneven, hesitant. But soon it steadied. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't write Luke's story. Instead, she wrote a fictional girl who had left a town and came back only when the world grew too quiet. She wrote about a father who built bridges to fix what he couldn't say. About a mother who didn't know how to let go of grief, but never let go of love. About a friend who had waited a decade without asking for anything in return. She wrote until the sun dipped low and the light turned golden. When she finished, she set down her pen and felt something she hadn't in years. Light. That Sunday, she printed the story and left a copy on her father's grave. She didn't say anything, just placed it beneath a smooth stone, let the breeze catch the edge of the page, and walked away. She crossed the bridge on the way back, and halfway across, she stopped. The water rushed below, constant and unbothered. Jessie met her on the other side. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. They just walked in the same direction, quiet and sure. Back in town, people began using the bridge more, not just to get from one side to the other, but to gather, to sit, to remember. Cliff built a plaque that read, "Rebuilt by the community," In memory of those we carry with us, Madeline taught a new writing unit that fall, writing across, building stories that bridge us. Some students wrote about being afraid. Others wrote about leaving. One boy wrote about forgiveness in the shape of a garden. A girl wrote about her sister who hadn't spoken in 2 years. They read their stories on the bridge. And in that space between trees and creek and air, words floated honest, brave, unpolished, real. On the last night of October, Jessie brought a single lantern to the bridge. They lit it together. It rose into the night sky, slow and bright. As they watched it disappear into the stars, Madeline whispered, "I think I finally understand why Dad built this bridge." Jessie glanced sideways. Why? Because some distances aren't measured in miles, and some returns aren't about coming back but about crossing over.